What would you do if a simple act of kindness changed the course of your life forever? Brandon Carter was a man who no longer believed in miracles. A single dad struggling to survive in a small town, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. When a stormy night throws a stranger into his path, Brandon has no idea he's about to find not just the salvation he so desperately needed, but also something he didn't even dare hope for anymore. Hope itself. Brandon Carter gripped the steering wheel tight as the old pickup truck creaked along the rain-soaked road of Willow Creek, Georgia. The torrential rain hammered against the windshield with such fury that the wipers could barely keep up. Sitting beside him, his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, clutched her little backpack to her chest, her wide eyes staring silently ahead. "It's gonna be okay, sweetheart," Brandon muttered, his voice tight. They were late. Again. Ever since he lost his job at the lumber mill, every day had been a different kind of battle. Late bills, temp jobs, the constant worry written all over Sophie's young face. The truck gave a sputtering cough, forcing Brandon to pull over to the shoulder. He let his head fall lightly against the steering wheel, frustrated. Just great, just the cherry on top of the day. He looked over at Sophie, forcing a smile. "Hang tight, Angel. Daddy's gonna fix it." Climbing out into the slicing rain, Brandon popped the hood and tried to figure out what was wrong. While he silently cursed his luck, movement caught his eye. A woman, soaked from head to toe, was stumbling along the side of the road, holding a battered purse over her head in a feeble attempt to shield herself. Without thinking, Brandon shouted over the roar of the storm, "Hey, you need some help?" The woman hesitated. She looked wary. And who could blame her? But when another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, she ran toward the pickup. Brandon threw open the passenger door. "Get in! You're gonna catch pneumonia out there." She hesitated just a second before climbing in. Inside the truck, Sophie stared at the woman with wide, curious eyes. "Thanks," the woman said, breathless, pulling her wet hair out of her face. She was beautiful, but there was something broken in her eyes. Something Brandon recognized because he saw it in the mirror every day. "No problem," Brandon replied. "Where are you headed?" She seemed to think for a second before answering. "Anywhere the rain can't find me." Brandon let out a tired laugh. "Well, this is Willow Creek. If you want, I can drop you off at Margie's Diner. They stay open late." The woman smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. My name's Madeline." "Brandon," he said. "And this here's my little girl, Sophie." Sophie gave a small wave, still staring at Madeline with that innocent curiosity only kids have. As Brandon carefully drove toward town, something strange happened. For the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone. It was like, in the middle of that brutal storm, he'd found a little island of calm. A quiet presence that somehow made the world feel a little less heavy. He didn't know it yet, but that simple, unplanned encounter was about to change everything. If you believe small gestures can change destinies, stick around. Because this is a story about second chances, about hope, and about finding love where you least expect it. Now sit back, relax, and let's keep going on this journey together. Margie's Diner was one of the few places in Willow Creek where time seemed to stand still. The warm, yellow lights cast a cozy glow against the rain-fogged windows, and the air was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and apple pie. Brandon held the door open for Madeline and Sophie to step inside. The owner, Margie, a sturdy, smiling older woman, waved from the kitchen. "Come on in, honey. Looks like you brought the storm with you." Madeline thanked her with a shy smile, while Brandon led Sophie over to one of the booths by the window. He ordered 2 hot chocolates and a warm bowl of soup for Madeline, insisting despite her quiet protests. She looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't used to accepting help from strangers. Brandon understood. He'd been there too, where pride fought tooth and nail against plain old need. While Sophie doodled on a napkin with a crayon Margie kindly handed over, Brandon tried to make small talk. "You got family around here?" he asked, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't scare her off. Madeline absent-mindedly stirred her spoon around her cup. "No. Actually, I'm just passing through." Brandon nodded. "Sometimes, an unexpected stop is exactly what we need." Madeline looked up at him, and for a moment it seemed like she was about to say something, but then she just gave a faint smile and turned back to the window, where the rain kept drumming down mercilessly. When the soup arrived, Brandon noticed Madeline eating with the hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. It tugged at his heart. He knew that hunger, the kind that came with silent desperation. After they finished, Brandon got up to pay the bill at the counter. When he came back to the table, Madeline was gone. He looked around, confused. Sophie looked surprised too, her eyes wide. "She left?" Sophie asked in a small voice. Brandon glanced out the window, but there was no sign of Madeline. Just the wet street and the flickering lights of the lampposts. He rushed outside, not caring about the fine rain still falling, calling out, "Madeline?" No answer. Margie came to the door, drying her hands on her apron. "She left this," she said, handing him a small, worn brown canvas bag. Brandon took it, not sure what to think. Inside, there was just an extra blouse, an empty wallet, and a folded note. With hesitant hands, he unfolded the paper. "Thank you for your kindness. I needed to believe there are still good people out there." Monsieur Brandon felt a strange tightness in his chest. He didn't even know her last name. Didn't know where she had gone. All he knew was that this mysterious woman had left a mark on him that wouldn't fade any time soon. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Will she come back, Daddy?" Brandon knelt down to her level, forcing a smile. "I don't know, sweetheart, but sometimes some people cross our path just to remind us that kindness still exists." Sophie thought for a moment, then slowly nodded, like she was accepting a truth bigger than she could fully understand. They went back to the pickup, and Brandon drove home in silence, the bag forgotten on the passenger seat. The road still shimmered under the rain, but now it felt different. Like somehow the world had shifted just a little that night. Brandon thought he'd never see Madeline Brooks again. He was wrong, very wrong. Life, as always, went on. Brandon slipped back into his routine of waking up early, making breakfast for Sophie, and hustling for odd jobs around town. Sometimes, between patching up roofs and fixing fences, his mind would drift back to that rainy night and the woman who'd vanished as quickly as she appeared. But like so many things in Brandon's life lately, Madeline Brooks became just another memory he couldn't afford to chase. His biggest concern now was Sophie. Her school, Willow Creek Elementary, was going through changes. Rumors were buzzing around town. Some new investor had bought the place. Families whispered in Margie's diner, at the grocery store, even at church on Sundays. "I heard they're gonna fire half the teachers," said Mrs. Turner, the cashier at the market. "Hope it's someone who actually cares about the kids," Pastor Joe muttered, frowning. Brandon listened to it all quietly, carrying the same knot of worry in his chest. Sophie loved school. It was her safe haven in the middle of their chaotic life. So when a notice about a parent meeting came home, Brandon didn't think twice. He needed to fight for what was best for his daughter, like he always had. That Friday afternoon brought a humid, sticky heat to Willow Creek. Brandon adjusted the collar of his borrowed shirt and held Sophie's hand tight as they crossed the school courtyard, where colorful balloons and optimistic banners tried to mask the tension in the air. Inside the auditorium, a small crowd had already gathered. Parents whispered to each other. Teachers exchanged nervous looks. Brandon and Sophie took seats in the back row, where he could watch without drawing too much attention. That's when the stage door opened, and a woman walked in. And for a moment, Brandon's whole world stopped. Madeline. She was there, alive, real. No longer the fragile figure caught in the rain, but a strong, confident presence. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and in her eyes, there was something different. A quiet strength that hadn't been there the night he found her. Brandon couldn't breathe. Madeline walked up to the microphone, the click of her heels echoing through the silent room. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Madeline Brooks, and starting today I have the honor of being the new owner and principal of Willow Creek Elementary." A buzz shot through the room like a jolt of electricity. Brandon felt Sophie squeeze his hand, her little eyes wide with surprise. Madeline went on, "I know change can be scary, but I want you to know that I'm here because I believe in every child in this school. I believe each one deserves a better future, and I'm committed to making this a place where that can happen." Brandon could barely process what he was hearing. Madeline Brooks. The woman he'd found lost on the road. The woman he hadn't been able to forget. Now, standing right there in front of him, with a clear purpose, leading the school that meant the world to his daughter. Madeline scanned the crowd, and then her eyes found his. For a second, she hesitated. The smile on her lips faltered just a little. She remembered. Brandon saw it, felt it. Madeline took a deep breath and picked up her speech like nothing had happened, but the silent exchange between them had said it all. The meeting went on, but Brandon barely heard another word. His heart was pounding, racing. Madeline Brooks was back in his life, and this time it looked like she was here to stay. What Brandon didn't know yet was that Madeline had secrets too. Secrets that could either bring them closer together or tear them apart. And deep down, one question kept echoing in his mind. Why had she left that night? And more importantly, why had she come back? Brandon didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, his mind spinning in circles. Madeline Brooks, the woman from the road, now the new principal of his daughter's school. What kind of crazy coincidence was this? Sophie, of course, was over the moon. She went on and on about how Madeline had smiled at the kids, how she promised new playground equipment and fresh art classes. To Sophie, Madeline was already a hero. To Brandon, she was a mystery that needed answers. Saturday morning, while Sophie played in the backyard, Brandon decided he couldn't just sit around anymore. He threw on the first clean t-shirt he could find, pulled a cap onto his head, and drove to the school. The campus was quiet at that hour, except for a few voices coming from the administrative wing. Brandon followed the sound until he found Madeline, alone, stacking boxes in what used to be the old principal's office. She didn't notice him right away. She had her back to him, focused, her hair twisted into a loose bun with a few golden strands escaping. Brandon hesitated for a second. Part of him wanted to turn around, to pretend that intense connection he'd felt in the rain meant nothing. But another part, the part that had been growing ever since he saw her on stage, couldn't walk away. He knocked lightly on the doorframe. Madeline spun around quickly, surprise flashing in her eyes. When she saw who it was, she froze. "Brandon?" she breathed, barely above a whisper. He took off his cap, not quite sure what to do with his hands. "Hey, Madeline." The silence between them was thick, full of all the things they hadn't said that stormy night. Finally, she broke the ice. "I figured we'd run into each other sooner or later." Brandon let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, small town." She smiled faintly, but there was tension hanging in the air. Like every word was a tightrope stretched over a canyon neither of them wanted to fall into. Brandon took a step closer. "Why'd you leave that night?" Madeline looked away, nervously adjusting a box on the table. "It was better that way." "Better for who?" Brandon pressed, his voice low but firm. She sighed, the weight of it visible on her shoulders. "I couldn't stay, Brandon. Not then. I had things I needed to sort out in my life, things I couldn't drag anyone else into." Brandon crossed his arms, watching her. "And now? All sorted?" Madeline bit her bottom lip, hesitating. Almost. Not exactly the reassuring answer he was hoping for, but before he could push any further, Sophie came running down the hallway, her backpack bouncing against her back. "Daddy, I found you," she squealed, throwing herself into Brandon's arms. Madeline smiled at the little girl, a real smile, full of tenderness. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. Madeline wasn't just a part of his past anymore. She was planted firmly in his daughter's present. And maybe, just maybe, in his too. He scooped Sophie up and looked at Madeline. "We're sticking around for the school fair today," he said, without really thinking. Madeline blinked, surprised. "I'll be here too, working the library booth." Brandon nodded. "Then, I guess I'll see you later." He was turning to leave when he heard her voice, soft and hesitant. "Brandon, thank you for that night." He turned back, meeting her eyes. "I needed to believe there were still good people out there." Brandon held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. "We all do," he said, before heading down the hall. As he walked away with Sophie in his arms, Brandon felt something shifting inside him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. The school fair was the kind of event Brandon usually avoided. Upbeat music echoed through the halls, kids ran everywhere clutching cotton candy and colorful toys, and parents stood in little groups, laughing and swapping gossip. Sophie, of course, was in heaven. She dragged Brandon from booth to booth with endless energy, trying out face painting, toy fishing, and the balloon dart toss. Brandon, on the other hand, felt completely out of place, like he always did in crowds. Until he saw her. Madeline was at the library booth, organizing old books on a makeshift table under a handmade banner that read, "Take a book home." She wore a simple white dress, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder, and she was laughing with a kid who was struggling to pick between two giant books. Brandon felt his stomach flip. He had never believed in fate. Never believed life had good surprises in store for people like him. But there she was again, like the whole universe was trying to tell him something. Sophie tugged on his hand. "Daddy, come on! I want to see the books." He couldn't resist. As they walked closer, Madeline looked up. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Her smile faltered slightly, like she still wasn't sure how to really approach him. "Hi, Sophie," Madeline said warmly. "Here to pick out a book?" Sophie nodded eagerly. Brandon stood behind her, hands in his pockets, just watching. Madeline handed Sophie a shiny covered book, and the little girl immediately plopped down on the floor, flipping through the pages, lost to the world. Only then did Madeline look up at Brandon. "I didn't think you'd come." Brandon shrugged. "Sophie talked me into it." Madeline smiled. A small smile, but a real one. She's got a gift for that. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and awkward at the same time. Before Brandon could say anything, a voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Madeline." They both turned. A man in a gray suit, hair perfectly combed, was walking toward them. Tall, confident, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Madeline stiffened. Brandon noticed it instantly, the way she stepped back half a step, the way her hands nervously gripped the edge of the makeshift counter. "Chris," she said, her voice tight. The man, Chris, completely ignored Brandon, zeroing in on her. "We need to talk." Brandon instinctively stepped a little closer to Madeline. He didn't know who this guy was, but he could read a situation. And this one didn't look good. Madeline forced a polite smile. "Now's not a good time. I'm working." Chris laughed, a cold, unpleasant sound. "That never stopped you before." Brandon felt the tension in the air, thick like the charge before a thunderstorm. "She asked you to wait," Brandon said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet, unmistakable threat. Finally, Chris looked at him, sizing him up with clear disdain. "And you are?" "Friend," Brandon answered without missing a beat. Madeline shot him a quick look, a mix of gratitude and surprise. Chris sighed, adjusting his tie. "This isn't over, Madeline." He turned and disappeared into the crowd. The silence he left behind was heavy. Madeline exhaled slowly, like she was trying to get a grip on something inside her. Brandon didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he simply said, "You okay?" She blinked a few times before nodding. "Yeah, thanks." Sophie, oblivious to everything, held up her chosen book and beamed. "Daddy, look! I found the perfect book." Brandon forced a smile for his daughter, then looked back at Madeline. There was something about her, something hidden, something painful, that he still didn't understand. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going anywhere, and this time she wouldn't be the one disappearing without a trace. The fair wrapped up shortly after sunset, when the last of the balloons sagged and the kids, exhausted, were carried home on their parents' shoulders. Brandon helped Sophie tuck her new book into her backpack, and together they walked toward the parking lot. That's when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Brandon." He turned. Madeline was standing a few feet back, the golden light of late afternoon outlining her in soft curves, but her eyes were dark, full of something Brandon knew all too well, fear. He quickly said, "Sophie, why don't you run inside and grab a cookie from Margie? I'll catch up with you." Sophie, oblivious to the tension, happily skipped back into the cafeteria. Brandon stepped closer to Madeline. She was fidgeting with her hands, nervous. "About this afternoon," she started. Brandon lifted his hand, gently stopping her. You don't have to explain, but if you want to talk, I'm here. Madeline bit her lower lip, fighting with herself. For a long moment, Brandon thought she was going to back off, hide behind that wall of silence he himself had used so many times. But then, with a defeated sigh, she spoke. Chris is my ex-husband. Brandon felt his stomach turn. He was controlling, manipulative. By the time I realized it, it was already too late. He had isolated me from everything and everyone. Madeline crossed her arms over her chest like she was trying to shield herself from her own words. I ran away from him a year ago. Left everything behind. Money, security, all of it. I just wanted my life back. Brandon stayed silent, letting her talk at her own pace. When you found me on that road, I was running, with no direction, no plan, just running. She looked up at him then, and Brandon saw not just fear in her eyes, but also shame. I should have said something, should have thanked you properly. But I was so used to not trusting anyone. The only thing I knew how to do was disappear. Brandon took a deep breath. You don't owe me any explanations, Madeline. She gave him a small, sad smile. Maybe not, but I owe it to myself, to be honest this time. Brandon stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to run now. Madeline let out a soft, bitter laugh, like she wanted to believe him, but didn't know how. He found me, Brandon. And he doesn't give up easily. Brandon felt a wave of quiet rage rising inside him. Not against her, but against the man who had made Madeline doubt even the good things in life. He shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to control the urge to promise her the world right there and then. Then let me help. If he comes after you here, he'll have to get through me first. Madeline's eyes widened, surprised by the determination in his voice. For a moment, the fear vanished from her face, replaced by something Brandon barely dared to name. Hope. Sophie appeared in the hallway, carrying a pack of cookies, grinning from ear to ear. Daddy, I got one for you too. Brandon smiled, taking the cookie, but he didn't take his eyes off Madeline. It's gonna be okay, he said, more for her than for himself. Madeline didn't answer, but as she turned to leave, her shoulders looked just a little less heavy. Brandon stood there, watching, as night slowly fell over Willow Creek. He knew this was just the beginning. If he wanted a real chance with Madeline, he'd have to prove he was different. He'd have to prove that sometimes the past doesn't have to define the future. And above all, he'd have to protect not just Sophie, but also the woman who was already stirring feelings inside him he wasn't ready to admit. Not yet. The next few days were a mix of calm and anticipation. Madeline kept the school running like clockwork. She supervised renovations, launched incentive programs for the kids, and even won over the most skeptical teachers. To the eyes of Willow Creek, she was a passionate and dedicated principal. But Brandon knew there was a storm brewing, invisible to most. Chris. The threat hung in the air like distant thunder, and Brandon couldn't ignore it. That afternoon, after dropping Sophie off at her art class, Brandon decided he needed answers. He didn't want to invade Madeline's privacy, but he had to know what they were up against. He went to Margie's diner, the place where everything, and everyone, eventually showed up. Margie, who knew everyone in Willow Creek and half the people outside it, was behind the counter pouring coffee. Brandon sat on a stool, ordered a black coffee, and casually asked, Margie, you know anyone named Chris? Chris Brooks? Margie frowned, thinking. Brooks! Brooks! She wiped her hands on her apron. Oh, sure, Chris Brooks. Rich guy. Family's from Atlanta. His dad was one of those big real estate investors. Not exactly a popular name around here. Brandon tensed. You heard anything about him lately? Margie glanced around, as if weighing her words. Nothing good. Heard he's facing lawsuits in Atlanta, misusing funds, blackmail, some pretty heavy stuff. But you know how it is. People with money never really pay. Brandon's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Chris wasn't just a bitter ex-husband. He was dangerous. Margie lowered her voice. And if the Madeline Brooks who took over the school is the one I'm thinking of, she was smart to get out. Brandon thanked her and left, his stomach churning. He had to warn Madeline, had to protect her for real. He found her later that day, in the little garden behind the school. Madeline was on her knees, planting flowers with a few kids, their laughter filling the air like music. Brandon stood still for a moment, just watching. Madeline looked so peaceful there, like she was finally building something good after so much chaos. But he knew that peace was fragile, and it was about to be shattered. When the kids left, Brandon walked over. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. Madeline looked at him, her smile fading. Just by looking into his eyes, she knew. They sat down on a wooden bench under the old oak tree. "I asked around about Chris," Brandon began. Madeline stiffened. "Not to judge you," he rushed to say, "but because I needed to know who we're dealing with." She closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. "And?" Brandon ran a hand through his hair. "He's in deep trouble, Madeline. Fraud, blackmail, big stuff. If he's trying to find you, it's not just out of resentment. It's because he needs to control what he still thinks belongs to him." Madeline shivered, hugging herself. Without thinking, Brandon placed his hand over hers. "You're not alone. Not anymore." For a moment, she looked like she might break. But with visible effort, she lifted her chin. "I can't let him take this away from me," she whispered, glancing back at the school. "Not after everything I fought to build here." Brandon squeezed her hand firmly. "Then we'll fight. Together." Madeline turned to him, her eyes shining not just with fear, but with something new. Trust. "Are you sure, Brandon? Because this could get ugly." He didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." She let out a shaky laugh, a mix of relief and something that sounded a lot like hope. And sitting there on that wooden bench under the Georgia sky that was starting to turn orange and pink, Brandon knew he had just made a promise. Not just to Madeline, but to himself. He would fight for her, for Sophie, for this new life that, against all odds, was starting to take shape. And nothing, not Chris, not the past, was going to take that away from them. The warning came quietly. The next morning, after Brandon dropped Sophie off at school, he noticed something strange. A black car parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine running. He frowned, watching. That car didn't belong to anyone from Willow Creek. He knew everyone here. He could tell the difference between normal and threatening. Throughout the day, the car stayed there. Brandon tried to brush it off, but a tight knot grew in his stomach. Something wasn't right. When the final bell rang and the kids came running out to meet their parents, Brandon kept his eyes glued to Sophie, who was skipping happily down the school steps, with Madeline laughing softly behind her. That's when he saw him. Chris. Standing across the street, leaning against the black car, arms crossed, watching them with a cold smile on his lips. Brandon's blood froze. He crossed the street in long strides, instinctively putting himself between Chris and the girls. Chris raised an eyebrow. "Relax. I'm just here to see how my wife's doing." Brandon felt the tension climb up his spine. "Ex-wife," he corrected, voice low and controlled. Madeline gripped Sophie's hand, gently pulling her behind her. Chris gave a half smile. "Details. We always find our way back home sooner or later." Brandon stepped forward. "If you lay a finger on her or my daughter, you'll regret it." Chris chuckled, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Easy there, cowboy. I didn't come here to start a fight. Just wanted to deliver a message." He looked straight at Madeline, completely ignoring Brandon. "You think changing your name, your town, your life changes who you are, but it doesn't. You belong to me." Madeline went pale, but she kept her chin up. Chris adjusted the cuff of his jacket and, without rushing, walked back to his car. Before getting in, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "See you soon." The engine roared to life, and the car disappeared down the dirt road, kicking up dust. Brandon immediately turned to Madeline. "You okay?" She just nodded, stiff. Sophie, confused, looked between them. "Daddy, who was that bad man?" Brandon knelt in front of her, forcing a calm smile. "Just a man who's gone now, sweetheart. You don't have to worry." But he was worried. Very much so. That night, Brandon locked every door in the house, checked the windows twice, and kept his phone fully charged on the nightstand. Madeline, on the other hand, seemed to slip back into automatic mode, quiet, closed off, like she had turned into the scared woman from the rainstorm all over again. Brandon knew she needed space, but he also knew He couldn't let her face this alone. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps on the porch. He got up quietly, adrenaline rushing through him. But it was just Madeline. She was sitting on the front steps, hugging her knees, staring up at the starry sky. Brandon approached slowly, sitting down beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth. Finally, Madeline broke the silence. "I thought I was safe. I thought I'd left it all behind." Brandon looked at her. "You are safe. I promise." Madeline let out a bitter laugh. "No one can promise that." Brandon turned fully toward her, his voice steady. "I can promise you won't have to face this alone." She looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to decide whether she could trust again. And deep in her eyes, Brandon saw it. A spark. A faint but living spark of hope. He reached out, not to force anything, but simply to leave his hand there. A silent offer. Madeline hesitated. Then, slowly, she placed her hand over his. And in that simple touch, in that quiet connection, Brandon knew they were going to fight, together. And this time, they weren't backing down. The next day, the whole town felt different to Brandon. Every corner, every unfamiliar car, every curious glance seemed like a disguised threat. It wasn't just about protecting Madeline anymore. It was about protecting Sophie, too. About protecting everything they were starting to build. Brandon knew they couldn't face Chris alone. They needed help. At first, Madeline resisted. She hated the idea of dragging other people into danger. But Brandon stood firm. "If you want to just stand around waiting for him to strike, fine. But I'm not going to let that happen." Madeline looked at him long and hard. And for the first time, Brandon saw the warrior she'd been trying to hide. "All right," she said, her voice low but determined. "Let's do this the right way." Their first stop was the local sheriff, Frank Dalton, a middle-aged man with a sun-weathered face and a heart as big as the town. Frank listened to the whole story in silence, leaning back in his old wooden chair at the tiny sheriff's office. When they finished, he scratched at his graying beard and said, "Chris Brooks, huh? Heard of him. Never anything we could prove, though." Brandon crossed his arms. "And now? Can you do anything?" Frank sighed. "Without solid evidence, I can't stop the guy from hanging around town. But I can make it real clear he's not welcome here." Madeline twisted her hands nervously. Frank leaned forward, his expression hardening. "And if he crosses the line, you won't even have to worry. I'll personally drag him out of here." Brandon nodded, feeling a tiny piece of the tension ease off. But they knew Chris was smart, and he probably wouldn't attack directly. They were gonna need more than the law. They were gonna need the town. That night, Madeline called a meeting at the school. This wasn't just about her or Brandon. It was about protecting what Willow Creek stood for. Parents, teachers, neighbors, they all crammed into the small gymnasium. Brandon was surprised by how many people showed up. Madeline stepped up onto the makeshift stage, her head held high, though Brandon could see the subtle tremble in her hands. She took a deep breath and spoke. "Some of you know I took over this school not long ago. What you don't know is that someone from my past has come here to threaten me. It's not just me he wants to destroy. It's everything we're trying to build here." There were murmurs through the crowd. Madeline continued, "I fought hard to get here, and I'm not going to let fear take this away from me. But I need your help." She looked at every face in the room. "I need to know, is this town going to fight with me, or am I going to have to fight alone?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then, Margie stood up first. "You gave me the chance to teach reading to the kids for free. I'm with you." Next came Pastor Joe. "This town needs more people like you, not fewer." Soon, a wave of support swept through the room. Parents, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers. Willow Creek had chosen a side, and it wasn't Chris Brooks's. Brandon looked at Madeline, and she met his gaze. In that silent exchange, there was something stronger than promises or words. There was belonging. There was home. Later, as they left the meeting, Madeline walked alongside Brandon under the starry sky. She looked at him, her smile a mix of relief and defiance. "You knew they'd back me up?" Brandon shrugged, giving a small smile. "I believed they would." Madeline stopped, facing him. "Thank you, Brandon, for everything." He stepped a little closer. You don't have to thank me. You gave me something worth fighting for again. For a moment, the distance between them seemed to disappear. But before anything else could happen, Brandon's phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered, the smile still on his face, but it quickly vanished. Sheriff Frank's voice was tense on the other end. Brandon, we've got a problem. Brandon pressed the phone tighter to his ear. What happened, Frank? He asked, already feeling anxiety grip his chest. The sheriff's voice was grave. Someone broke into the school. Brandon stopped in the middle of the street, his blood turning cold. Madeline's with me, he answered quickly. I know. That's why I'm calling. I need you both to come down here right now. Brandon hung up and looked at Madeline, his face hardening. We have to go. She didn't ask any questions, just nodded. Deep down, she already knew. The drive to the school was a blur. When they arrived, they saw 2 patrol cars with flashing lights reflecting off the white walls of the school. Frank met them at the entrance, his face grim. The back door was forced open, he explained. Nothing was stolen. Nothing except, he hesitated, except Sophie's class mural. Brandon frowned. Her class mural? Frank nodded. They tore down all the pictures, ripped up the drawings. Madeline put her hand over her mouth, horrified. Brandon felt anger rising, hot and pounding. It was a message. Chris didn't want money. He didn't want property. He wanted fear. Frank crossed his arms. I installed new cameras last week, thanks to your pushing, he said to Brandon. We got it on tape. He handed over his phone with the video already queued up. Brandon watched. The grainy footage showed a figure sneaking in through the back door. Even with the hood pulled low over his head, Brandon recognized the way he moved. The arrogance in his stride. Chris. Frank sighed. That's enough for a warrant. I'll get in touch with the county judge. Madeline closed her eyes, breathing deeply. He's not gonna stop, she whispered. Not until he gets what he wants. Brandon placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Then we won't stop either. Madeline opened her eyes, meeting his. There was fear there, sure, but there was also something new. Determination. Frank cleared his throat. If you want protection, I can station a unit outside your house for a while. Brandon nodded without hesitation. Please. Madeline murmured a quiet thank you. While Frank organized the deputies to keep watch over the house, Brandon led Madeline to the car. She was trembling. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her everything would be okay. But he knew Madeline was too proud to accept pity. So he just drove in silence, his steady presence beside her like an anchor in the middle of the storm. When they got home, Brandon locked everything again, even more carefully this time. Sophie was sleeping soundly in her room, blissfully unaware of the chaos. Madeline stood frozen in the living room, hugging her arms around herself. Brandon approached slowly. Hey, he said softly. She turned to him, and before she could think twice, Brandon pulled her into his arms. Madeline hesitated for a second, and then finally let go. She cried silently against his chest, like years of fear and exhaustion were finally spilling out. Brandon held her tightly, saying nothing, just letting her fall apart in peace. Because he knew. Sometimes silence spoke louder than any words. After a while, Madeline pulled away, wiping her face with her hands. Sorry, she murmured. Brandon shook his head. You've got nothing to be sorry for. She looked at him, her voice thick with emotion. I'm scared, Brandon. He brushed his fingers gently across her face. So am I. She smiled then, a weak but real smile. And that night, while the storm raged outside and the threat hung heavy in the air, Brandon and Madeline understood one simple truth. Fear didn't have to win, as long as they faced it together. The days that followed were a quiet battle. The police cruiser stayed parked outside Brandon's house every night, its discreet lights blinking in the darkness. Madeline went back to school like nothing had happened, keeping her head high, smiling at the kids, organizing meetings, leading projects. But Brandon saw the signs, the way she glanced over her shoulder when walking to the car, the way she double-locked her office door, the shadows under her eyes that she tried to hide behind her smiles. Chris was still out there, and everyone knew it. On Friday morning, Sheriff Frank knocked on their door. Brandon answered, his face tight. We've got news, Frank said, stepping inside. Madeline appeared in the living room, her face pale. Frank was holding a thick envelope. "We caught him trying to bribe a clerk at the town hall. He was trying to get fake documents in your name. When the guys saw the license plate, they called us." Brandon felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. "And now? We've got enough to arrest him for real. The judge already issued the warrant. We're going after him now." Madeline crossed her arms over her chest, trying to hold herself together. "Will he pay for what he's done?" Frank looked at her seriously. "He'll answer for his crimes, but you know how this stuff goes. Lawyers, bail. It might take time." Brandon clenched his fist at his side. "Then we get ready for whatever comes." Frank nodded. "And keep your guard up. He'll know we're coming for him." After Frank left, Brandon found Madeline standing in the hallway, staring out the window. He walked up and gently placed his hand on her back. "He's not going to break you, Madeline." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "You're that sure, huh?" Brandon gave her a crooked smile. "I am." She studied his face for a long moment. "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I know you. Maybe you don't see it yet, but you're the strongest woman I've ever met." Madeline let out a soft, broken laugh, but it was real. "And you're the most stubborn man, only about the things that matter." And without thinking, Brandon stepped closer. Madeline didn't pull away. For the first time, she let her head rest gently against his chest, breathing him in. Brandon wrapped his arms around her like he could shield her from the whole world. And maybe, just maybe, in that moment, he could. For a while, they just stood there, in silence. But the peace was shattered when the phone rang. Brandon answered. It was Frank. "He's gone," the sheriff said, his voice tight. "His car was found abandoned outside town. Chris disappeared." Brandon felt his stomach sink. Madeline looked up at him, reading the answer on his face before he could say a word. "He'll come back," she whispered. Brandon gripped the phone tightly. "Then we'll be ready." But the truth was, deep down, Brandon knew Chris was too dangerous to underestimate. And whatever he was planning now would be even worse than before. Because men like Chris Brooks, when cornered, didn't back down. They attacked. And next time, it could be devastating. Brandon didn't waste a second. As soon as he hung up the phone, he gathered Madeline and Sophie in the living room. "Grab whatever you can carry in 5 minutes," he said, his voice firm. Madeline's eyes widened. "You think he'll—" "I'm not taking any chances, Madeline. Not with you. Not with her." Sophie, scared, dropped the toy she was holding. Brandon knelt down and scooped his daughter into his arms. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're just going to spend a few days at Uncle Frank's farm, remember? You'll get to see the horses." Even confused, Sophie nodded, trusting her father's steady voice. Madeline rushed to pack some clothes into a backpack. Brandon grabbed their documents, some cash, and the spare key to the truck. In less than 10 minutes, they were on the road, leaving behind the sleeping town of Willow Creek. Frank's farm was half an hour away, tucked between green hills and old wooden fences. It was the only place Brandon knew they could find some peace, where Chris would have a harder time getting to them. When they arrived, Frank was already waiting on the porch, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Welcome to my little fortress," he said with a short smile. Brandon shook his hand, grateful. "Thanks, Frank." Frank nodded. "We'll take turns keeping watch. No one's getting in here without me knowing." Madeline stepped out of the truck, looking around. The silence of the farm was almost surreal after the tension of the past few weeks. Sophie ran straight for the small stable, thrilled by the horses. Madeline smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "She can still find joy," she murmured. Brandon stood beside her, watching. That's how kids are. They find hope even in the middle of the mess. Madeline turned to him, her eyes shining. "And you?" Brandon looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I see it when I look at you two." The silence that followed was heavy, but different from before. It was a silence of understanding, of connection, of something growing between them, inevitable and quiet. Night fell quickly. Frank set up a small security system around the property. Motion-activated lights, makeshift alarms, and of course the old rifle now leaning against the door. Brandon and Madeline shared the guest room. The tension of being so close was palpable, but there was something else too. Something warm. Something new. Madeline sat on the bed, hugging her knees, while Brandon finished locking the last window. "Do you think he'll find us?" she asked softly. Brandon sat down beside her. "Not while we're together." She turned her face toward him, so close Brandon could feel the warmth of her breath. Without thinking much, he touched her hand. "I'll protect you, Madeline, no matter what it takes." She bit her lower lip, struggling with something inside herself. Then, with a hesitant movement, she leaned closer. Brandon didn't move, letting her take the lead. And for the first time, Madeline laid her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that, in silence, listening to the wind outside and the distant sounds of the horses in the stable. That night, for the first time in a long while, Madeline slept deeply. And Brandon stayed awake, keeping watch. Because the world outside could be cruel. But there, on that little forgotten piece of land, he had found something worth protecting. Something he wasn't going to let slip away. Not ever again. Dawn brought a strange sense of calm. Brandon woke up early, as usual, and stepped out onto the porch of the farm. The sun was rising lazily over the green fields, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was all over. But that hope didn't last long. Frank appeared at the door, his face grim. "There's something you need to see." Brandon followed the sheriff down the dirt road leading to the farm. There, nailed to one of the fences, was a plastic-sealed envelope. Frank handed it to Brandon with a grave expression. Inside, a single sheet. And on it, a photo of Sophie, playing innocently with the horses the afternoon before. Brandon felt his blood run cold. Madeline, who had followed them, saw the photo and clutched her hand to her mouth, panic written all over her face. "He was here," she whispered. Brandon felt rage boil up inside him. Chris didn't just know where they were. He had been close, watching. Frank looked at them, tense. "This changes everything. He's playing dirty now." Brandon closed his eyes for a second, controlling the fury inside. "We're ending this," Frank nodded. "I already called the state. We'll have backup, but until then, it's just us." Madeline pulled Brandon aside. "What if he tries to take Sophie? What if he—" Brandon cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "He's not going to touch her. Not while I'm breathing." The fear in her eyes cut through Brandon like a blade, but she nodded, trusting him. And that was all he needed. Frank laid out a plan. They reinforced the house. If Chris wanted to get to them, he would have to expose himself. And then they'd catch him. It was risky, but it was their only shot. The day crawled by, every sound charged with tension. Madeline didn't let Sophie out of her sight for a second. Brandon patrolled the property like a wolf, alert to every movement, every shadow. When night fell, bringing with it the cold wind and the smell of wet earth, they all knew. It would be tonight. Frank took his post on watch, armed. Brandon and Madeline stayed inside the house, with Sophie sleeping in the bedroom, unaware of the danger lurking outside. The clock was ticking close to midnight when Brandon heard it. A snap, outside. He looked at Madeline. "Stay here," he whispered. She grabbed his hand for a second, desperate. "Be careful." He nodded and slipped outside. Frank was already moving silently toward the barn. Brandon headed for the side of the house, his eyes sweeping through the darkness. And then he saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. Chris. Brandon felt the world narrow around him, blood pounding in his ears. Without hesitation, he charged. Chris was trying to sneak around to the back of the house where Sophie was sleeping. Brandon sprinted, his body moving purely on instinct. He shouted, "Frank!" Chris turned, surprised, but it was too late. Frank appeared from the other side, gun drawn. "Freeze! Police!" Chris froze. But Brandon knew. Men like him didn't surrender easily. Chris reached for something at his waist, small, shiny, a knife. Brandon didn't think. He launched himself at him, tackling him to the ground. The knife flew out of Chris's hand. They fought in the wet dirt, fists flying, grunts of effort slicing through the night. Chris was fast, desperate, but Brandon was stronger. He pinned him down, knee in his back. Frank arrived seconds later, slapping the cuffs on Chris with quick, practiced movements. The enemy was finally contained. Chris cursed, struggling, but it was no use now. Frank hauled him to his feet. "You're under arrest, Chris Brooks, for breaking and entering, making threats, attempted kidnapping, and assault." Chris spat on the ground, shooting a venomous glare at Brandon. This isn't over. Brandon stepped closer, breathing hard. It is now. Frank pulled him back, leading Chris to the patrol car. When the vehicle disappeared down the dusty road, Brandon stood under the starry sky, body aching but soul light. Madeline ran to him, Sophie in her arms, scared. Brandon opened his arms, pulling them both in. Strong, unbreakable, they had won. For the first time in a very, very long time. They were safe. The next morning broke with a peace that was almost unbelievable. Brandon woke up early, as always, but for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel that crushing weight on his chest. Just the distant song of birds and the familiar smell of damp earth after the midnight rain. Madeline was still asleep, exhausted, with Sophie curled up beside her. Brandon spent a few minutes just watching them. There, in that simple room on the farm, he saw something he hadn't dared to wish for in a long time. Family. When Madeline woke up, they had breakfast together on the porch, the cool breeze gently stirring the kitchen curtain. Frank showed up soon after, his face finally relaxed. "Chris is going to be out of circulation for a good while," he said with a satisfied smile. "We got enough on him to guarantee a nice long stay at state prison." Madeline let out a slow breath, like she was only now allowing herself to believe she was truly free. Brandon looked at her, and without a word, he knew something had changed between them. Something permanent. Frank cleared his throat. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, but I think Willow Creek misses you." Madeline smiled, a small smile, but full of truth. "I miss home too." That afternoon, they packed up and headed back to town. Willow Creek looked different. Or maybe it was them who had changed. When they got to the school, the teachers and parents welcomed them with hugs, smiles, and even a few tears. Margie showed up with an apple pie, insisting it was medicinal. And in the middle of all the commotion, Sophie ran off to play with her friends on the playground, her laughter ringing freely through the air. Brandon and Madeline stood side by side, watching. "She deserves this," Madeline murmured. Brandon turned to her. "So do you." She laughed softly. "I don't know if I even remember how to live without looking over my shoulder." Brandon took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then I'll stay by your side, just to make sure." Madeline looked at him, the sunlight reflecting in her honey-colored eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, so much she deserved to hear. But for now, this was enough. The silent certainty that finally they had found where they belonged. As the sun dipped behind the hills and Willow Creek turned golden, Brandon knew, without a doubt, they had survived, not just the danger, but the fear, the past, and their own hearts. And from that day forward, there would be no more running, no more loneliness, just the future, uncertain, sure, but full of possibilities. And they were ready to live every second of it, together. The days that followed brought a calm that felt almost magical. Brandon helped out at the school however he could, fixing windows, rebuilding the playground, putting up new signs in the hallways. He and Madeline saw each other every day, sometimes casually, sometimes in glances that said more than any conversation ever could. Sophie seemed happier than ever, running across the school fields, her laughter echoing through the trees. Willow Creek, that little town forgotten by time, had become exactly what Brandon and Madeline needed. Home. But there was still one thing lingering between them, something that needed to be said, something neither dared to break until it became inevitable. And that moment came on a warm Saturday night. There was a festival in town, strings of lights hanging from the lampposts, live music playing at the gazebo, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy filling the air. Brandon and Madeline walked side by side through the square, watching Sophie spin around on the makeshift Ferris wheel. For a while, they just enjoyed the moment, smiling at each other like two people sharing an old secret. But when the music shifted to a slow, soft melody, something in the air grew thicker, more intimate. Madeline hesitated. Brandon saw the fear in her eyes, fear of taking the next step, fear of trusting again. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." Madeline laughed, shaking her head. "Brandon, I don't dance." "Neither do I," he said with a crooked smile. "But we can fake it together." She hesitated for a second, and then placed her hand in his. Brandon gently pulled her closer, their bodies fitting together in a way that felt right, inevitable. They danced awkwardly under the twinkling lights, between shy laughs and stolen glances, and in the middle of the dance, Madeline whispered, "I'm scared." Madeline whispered. Brandon stopped, gently cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "So am I." She blinked, surprised. He gave a small smile. "But I'd rather be scared with you than brave alone." Madeline let out a choked laugh, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're terrible at speeches," Brandon shrugged. "Maybe, but it's the truth." She looked at him for a long moment, like she was searching for all the cracks, all the imperfections, and finally she let go. Madeline rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was a timid kiss at first, hesitant, like two worlds testing if they could really touch without falling apart. But it quickly turned into something deeper, more urgent, a kiss that carried every unspoken promise, every scar, every bit of hope. When they pulled apart, Madeline rested her forehead against his, laughing softly. "You really are stubborn," Brandon smiled, his heart pounding in his chest. "Only about the things that matter." She looked at him, serious now. "Do I matter?" Brandon didn't hesitate for a second. "You're everything." She closed her eyes, soaking in every word. And for the first time in a long time, Madeline believed it. Not because Brandon promised everything would be perfect, but because, for the first time, she knew she wouldn't have to face the imperfect alone. And that was all she needed. The following Monday, routine felt new again. Madeline arrived at school early, a much easier smile on her face, the invisible weight she had carried for so long finally seeming to lift. Brandon showed up after dropping Sophie off in her classroom, always finding an excuse to hang around, fixing the garden fence, installing new benches in the courtyard, helping out wherever he could. The community, which had already embraced them during the crisis, now seemed to openly root for them. Margie made sure to send daily treats to the school, pies, cakes, cookies, always with a knowing wink at Madeline. And Sophie? Sophie bloomed like never before, running freely through the school fields, painting, drawing, laughing. Every smile she gave was a living reminder of how much it had all been worth it. But even amid this new calm, Brandon knew some wounds didn't heal that easily. One quiet afternoon, while they were painting the school's new mural with the kids, he noticed Madeline standing alone, staring off into the horizon, the brush forgotten in her hand. He approached her quietly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Madeline took a while to answer. How quickly everything can change, how it can all disappear. Brandon leaned his shoulder against hers discreetly. "That's not gonna happen." She let out a humorless laugh. "You can't promise that." Brandon turned to her, serious. "No, but I can promise that if the world falls apart, I'll be there to catch you." She looked at him, the sunlight glinting in her light eyes. "And if I fall?" Brandon gave a small smile. "Then I'll fall with you." Madeline bit her lower lip, fighting back her emotions. "I don't want to be a burden." Brandon frowned. "You're not a burden. You're the reason." She blinked, surprised. "Reason?" "Reason to fight, to stay, to build something worth having." The silence between them was filled with unspoken promises, old fears, and newly born hopes. Madeline took a deep breath. "I'm still so scared, Brandon." He touched her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then we'll face the fear together." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "You make it sound so easy." Brandon chuckled softly. "It's not, but it is simple." She pulled him closer, the gesture still hesitant but full of affection. And there, between paint cans and children's laughter, Brandon and Madeline took another step forward. It wasn't a promise of perfection. It was a promise to stay. And for them, in that moment, it was more than enough. The days that followed were some of the most peaceful Brandon could remember. He spent his mornings working at the school, his afternoons helping Frank on the farm, and his evenings sitting with Madeline on her porch, talking about everything and nothing, watching Sophie play with the stray dog they had adopted, a white mutt they named Buddy. It was a simple life, a life Brandon never knew he wanted until he found it. But deep down, he knew he needed to do more, something to prove that it wasn't just a phase or gratitude or impulse. It was love, real love. And love needed roots. That's why, on a golden Friday afternoon, Brandon took Madeline and Sophie for a drive outside town. He drove in silence, nervous, while Sophie chattered away happily in the back seat, excited about any trip that promised Buddy and ice cream at the end. Madeline, suspicious, looked at him. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" Brandon just smiled. "Trust me." When they arrived, Madeline's eyes widened. It was a small piece of land on the edge of Willow Creek, with an old wooden house, a wide porch, and a barn in the back. The yard was covered in wildflowers, and a white fence circled the property. Madeline got out of the car slowly, looking around, confused. Brandon came closer. "I bought it yesterday." She turned abruptly to him. "What?" Brandon shoved his hands in his pockets, suddenly nervous. "This is what I wanted to show you. A place. Our place." Madeline covered her mouth with her hands, tears filling her eyes. "Brandon," he stepped closer. "I don't just want to promise I'll stay. I want to build a life with you, with Sophie, here in Willow Creek." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Are you sure?" Brandon chuckled softly. "I've never been more sure of anything." Sophie ran across the field, Buddy barking behind her, the perfect scene for that perfect moment. Madeline looked at the little girl, then at Brandon, then at the house, and something inside her gave way. The last wall came down. She threw herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Brandon held her tightly, feeling the future finally settle into place. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes to everything." Brandon pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Madeline Brooks, or should I say, Madeline Reynolds, when you're ready, will you build this life with me?" She laughed, wiping away her tears. "I'll build this life with you, Brandon. Now and always." Sophie came running up to them, Buddy right behind her. "Daddy! Mommy! Look, there's a swing on the porch!" Brandon and Madeline laughed, their hearts so full it felt like they could burst. That simple, forgotten house would now be the start of everything. The start of a home, a family, a new story. And as the sun set behind the hills, bathing everything in gold and pink, Brandon knew they had found their happily ever after. Not perfect, but absolutely, wonderfully real. A few months later, summer in Willow Creek was in full swing. The fields around Brandon and Madeline's little new house stretched out like a golden sea, and the scent of wildflowers filled the air. On the porch, gently swinging in the new hammock, Brandon watched Sophie play with Buddy in the yard. Her laughter was music to his ears, light, free, fearless. Madeline appeared at the door, wiping her hands on a floral apron. "You planning to sit there admiring the view all day? Or are you going to help me put together the bookshelf?" she teased, a playful smile on her lips. Brandon laughed, gently rocking the hammock. "Admiration is an important part of the assembly process, you know?" Madeline crossed her arms, pretending to be serious. "Oh, really? Then, Mr. Reynolds, admire while you work." Brandon stood up lazily and walked over to her. Before she could protest, he pulled her into a gentle spin. She laughed, tapping him lightly on the shoulder. "Brandon, you love me," he said, that easy smile on his lips. She sighed dramatically, but her eyes were shining with happiness. "Unfortunately, yes." He kissed her forehead, feeling his heart warmed by a peace he never thought he'd find again. The afternoon passed lazily, full of small moments, assembling furniture, painting frames, testing and failing recipes in the kitchen. An ordinary life, an extraordinary life for those who had fought so hard to earn it. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and violet, Brandon, Madeline, and Sophie sat on the porch steps, Buddy curled up at their feet. Sophie leaned against Madeline's shoulder, already fighting sleep. "This was the best day ever," she mumbled. Madeline smiled, stroking her hair. "It really was." Brandon looked at the two of them, his heart swelling with gratitude. He never would have imagined that a lonely road on a rainy night would lead to this. But sometimes, he thought, the best stories started just like that. Not with grand promises, not with guarantees, but with a simple gesture, a hand extended in the rain, a choice to stay, a decision to love, even when it was scary. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Brandon took Madeline's hand, lacing his fingers with hers. She smiled at him, the smile he knew would always be home. And there, under the endless Willow Creek sky, with the scent of earth and hope in the air, they lived what they had always longed for. Not a perfect life, but a real life, a life together. And that was all that mattered.